Usually when we talk about like diagnosing a problem, there's this comforting expectation of precision, right?
Absolutely.
Like if you're an engineer looking at a bridge, you can calculate the exact stress point of a steel beam. Or if you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line and the doctor just points and says, there it is.
Right. It's binary. It's either broken or not broken. You get that definitive visual confirmation.
Exactly. But then you step into the world of human behavior. You try to map the landscape of why we do the things we do day in and day out, and suddenly that diagnostic x-ray machine just like shatters.
Yeah, the landscape gets incredibly murky.
So murky, especially when it comes to one of the most universal but honestly bizarre symptoms of modern life. And I'm talking to you, the listener, right now. Picture this. You're sitting on your couch on a Sunday afternoon.
Classic scenario.
Right. You've worked hard all week. You are physically and mentally exhausted. So you turn on the TV, you lie back, and within, 10 or 15 minutes, it hits you.
The guilt.
Yes. That creeping, heavy, deeply uncomfortable sensation in the pit of your stomach.
It's that inescapable feeling that you should be doing something, like anything, that counts as productive.
Which is crazy. Why do we feel so incredibly guilty when we're just, existing? Why is hustle culture such a dominant force? We treat the concept of wasting time as though it were an actual moral failing.
When realistically, it makes no biological sense whatsoever.
None. A lion doesn't feel guilty for sleeping 18 hours a day.
Right.
But we do. And to figure out the origin of that guilt, we are going to tear into one of the most famous, most fiercely debated, and frankly, most misunderstood texts in the entire history of the social sciences. We're doing a deep dive into Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism.
This book is monumental because, well, it's not just some dusty historical retrospective. It's a really daring attempt to sequence the psychological DNA of the modern world.
Yeah.
Weber set out to explain how a very specific, terrifying, religious anxiety like a 16th century panic about the afterlife managed to accidentally birth the modern economic order that basically dictates our lives today.
And we know you're tackling this material right now as an aspiring student, navigating undergraduate social science theory. And let's be honest, opening a century-old German sociological text can feel like hitting a brick wall of jargon.
Oh, totally.
So our mission today is to give you a masterclass level breakdown, and we've got a massive stack of sources on the table to help us do that.
Yeah. So to get to the core of Weber's argument, we're primarily working from Talcott Parsons' definitive translation of the original essays.
Right.
These were first published in 1904 and 1905, and Weber actually substantially revised them in 1920, literally right before he died.
Wow.
Yeah. And we're pairing that with Anthony Giddens' comprehensive introduction, which is really essential for grounding the text. And because we need to see if this theory actually holds water today, we are bringing in a century of academic backlash.
The drama.
Oh, yeah. We're capping it off with some cutting-edge quantitative data from modern economists who have, subjected Weber's historical claims to supercomputer analysis.
So we've got the original theology, the historical context, and the modern data smackdown. We are going to translate all this intimidating academic theory into clear mechanisms you can actually see operating in your own life. But before we get to the Protestant ethic or even capitalism, we have to set the stage.
Right, because ideas don't just fall out of the sky.
Exactly. They are forged in specific intellectual pressure cookers. And 1900 Germany was an absolute pressure cooker of academic warfare.
It really was. To understand the stakes of that warfare, we have to look at the massive divide in European thought at the turn of the 20th century. If you were, say, studying economics in Britain or America at the time, you were likely steeped in classical political economy and utilitarianism.
Okay.
The foundational assumption there was that human beings are naturally rational calculators. They're always trying to maximize their own utility.
The classic Homo economicus, right? The idea that a human is essentially just a rational walking spreadsheet.
Precisely. But in Germany, the academic establishment violently rejected that British model. The German university scene was dominated by what they called the historical school of economics, led by figures like Gustav von Schmoller.
And what was their issue with the spreadsheet model?
Well, they looked at the British model and argued that Homo economicus was a fantasy creature. They insisted that you cannot divorce economic behavior from its cultural, legal, and historical context. Like a medieval serf in Bavaria simply does not possess the same psychological machinery as a London stockbroker.
Hold on, I need to put myself in the shoes of a modern Econ 101 student for a second here.
Sure.
Because my immediate reaction is, well, isn't economics essentially just math?
That's the modern assumption, yeah.
Right. Isn't it driven by universal laws of supply and demand? Like, if a drought destroys the wheat crop, the price of bread goes up, regardless of whether you're in ancient Rome, medieval Germany, or modern New York. Why do we need to study culture and religion to understand basic economics?
And that exact tension is what sparked what was called the Methodist Strait.
The dispute over method.
Exactly. It was an intellectual civil war. On one side, the German historical school was saying, every society is unique. You must study the specific cultural fabric. On the other side, you had the Austrian School of Economics, led by Karl Menger.
Okay.
And Menger was doing exactly what you just suggested. He was building abstract mathematical models based on universal logical principles of marginal utility. The Austrians wanted economics to be a hard, predictive science, like physics.
Right.
And the historical school thought that was totally reductive and historically blind.
It sounds like a total deadlock. Like, the historians are saying everything is too complicated and unique for math, and the theorists are saying your history is just a pile of trivia without a mathematical formula to explain it.
It was a complete deadlock.
Mm-hmm.
And it had massive real-world implications, because these academics were the ones advising the newly unified German Empire on whether to adopt free trade or protectionist policies.
Oh, wow. So real policy was on the line.
High stakes. So Max Weber enters this arena trying to forge a middle path. He was trained simultaneously in law, economic history, and philosophy, so he deeply respected the historical school's obsession with cultural detail.
Sure.
But he also recognized that sociology needed to do more than just tell descriptive stories. It needed to provide causal explanations. He wanted to understand why historical shifts happened, which required abstract theory.
And his drive to figure this out wasn't just like academic, right? It was deeply personal.
Very personal.
Because the trajectory of Weber's own life heavily influenced this search. He didn't start out as this grand theorist of world religions. In his early 20s and 30s, he was a relentless workaholic buried in incredibly narrow technical economic history.
Yeah, his early output is astonishingly dense. I mean, he wrote a doctoral dissertation analyzing the legal structures of medieval trading companies in Italy.
Yikes.
Yeah. And then he followed that with a massive, exhaustive study on Roman agrarian land tenure. Then he conducted this brutal empirical survey of rural labor conditions for peasants in Eastern Germany. He was entirely in the weeds of raw historical and legal data.
But he was working himself to the bone, and it broke him.
It did.
He suffered a catastrophic nervous breakdown in his mid-30s. He was paralyzed by insomnia, anxiety, and exhaustion. For roughly 4 years, he was almost entirely incapacitated. I mean, he had to resign his professorship. He couldn't teach, he couldn't write, he could barely even read.
The irony is just profound. The man who would go on to write the definitive text on the psychological compulsion to work relentlessly was himself destroyed by that very compulsion.
Oh, yeah.
But when he finally began to recover and emerge from that dark period around 1903, his intellectual horizons had radically expanded. He pivoted away from those narrow technical histories.
He went big.
Huge. He started asking massive, sweeping questions about comparative civilizations, looking at China, India, ancient Judaism. And the Protestant ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism was really the first major breakthrough of this new post-recovery mindset.
It's as if he zoomed out from studying the microscopic structure of a single leaf to looking at the entire global forest, trying to understand why some forests grew tall and others didn't.
That's a great way to put it.
But in doing this, he had to confront the other massive intellectual heavyweight in the room. He wasn't just navigating between the historical and Austrian schools. He was dealing with the legacy of Karl Marx.
Right. And we need to navigate this carefully to ensure we're just outlining the theoretical mechanics here. But Weber's relationship to Marxism is the invisible engine driving a lot of this text.
Right, because Marxism was huge at the time.
Exactly. Weber belonged to a younger generation of liberal scholars who had a highly sophisticated understanding of Marxist theory. Now, classical Marxist historical materialism operates on a specific architectural metaphor. It posits that the base of any society, the material economy, the means of production, how labor is organized, determines the superstructure.
And the superstructure includes everything else, right? The laws, the political system, the art, and crucially for our purposes, the religion and theology.
Correct. In a strict historical materialist reading, ideas are largely epiphenomena.
Which means what, exactly?
It means they are reflections or justifications of the underlying economic reality. The material conditions drive history, And the religious doctrines are just the ideological shadows cast on the wall by the machinery of production.
And Weber reads this and basically says that is too simple. Now, to be fair to Weber, he is not swinging to the opposite extreme.
No, not at all.
He explicitly writes that he does not want to replace a one-sided materialist account of history with an equally one-sided idealist account. He isn't claiming that religion just magically conjured capitalism out of thin air.
No, he fully acknowledges the necessity of material conditions. You need the influx of precious metals, the development of population centers, the legal structures. But he is pushing back against the idea that theology is merely a passive byproduct.
Right.
He wants to demonstrate that subjective ideas, specifically complex theological concepts that nobody designed with the economy in mind, can act as independent causal variables.
Like switchmen on a railroad track.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Determining the direction that material interests will eventually push a society.
And he was testing this theory in real time against contemporary rival Werner Sombart, which Sombart is a fascinating character. He was writing a gigantic, multi-volume history called Der modern Kapitalismus right when Weber was writing his essay.
Yeah, they were colleagues, they even edited a journal together, but they had fundamentally different views on how capitalism actually started.
Right.
Sombart's approach was much closer to the materialist tradition. He looked for the origins of modern capitalism in tangible economic activities. He pointed to the massive accumulation of wealth from colonial expansion and commerce. He looked at the technical reorganization of trade and the putting out system.
Okay.
And notably, Sombart also heavily emphasized the role of marginalized groups, specifically Jewish merchants, in developing rational capitalist practices, which, by the way, is a thesis Weber strongly and extensively rebutted in his later work on ancient Judaism.
Right. So Sombart was basically saying, look at the ledger books of the Renaissance bankers. Look at the colonial trade routes. That's where capitalism was born.
Exactly.
And Weber looks at those exact same ledger books and says, no, that's where capitalism was practiced. But the spark that made it a universal, inescapable system, that didn't come from a ledger. That came from a pulpit.
And so Weber sets up this monumental methodological experiment. He decides to isolate the spirit, or the psychological ethos of capitalism, from the actual mechanical hardware of capitalism.
Yeah.
He wants to prove that before you can build a capitalist economy, you need a critical mass of people who possess a capitalist psychology.
So let's dive right into that psychology, which brings us to defining our terms. Because if we're going to talk about the spirit of capitalism, we need to know what Weber actually means by the word capitalism.
Crucial point.
And I remember reading this for the first time and having my mind blown because Weber states, right out of the gate, that capitalism has absolutely nothing to do with greed.
It is the most common and persistent misunderstanding of his work. If a student grasps nothing else from this deep dive, they need to grasp this distinction.
The way Weber writes about this is almost poetic. He says that the boundless lust for gain, the desire for wealth, has existed in all times and all places throughout human history. You find it in waiters, in physicians, in coachmen, in artists, in corrupt officials, in crusaders, gamblers, beggars. Everyone. The guy running a loaded dice scam in ancient Babylon was greedy. The pirate operating in the Caribbean was greedy. But neither of them were capitalists in the Weberian sense.
And the analytical logic here is flawless. Weber points out that greed is a historical constant. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
And you cannot use a constant to explain a variable.
Right.
If greed is a universal human trait, why did this specific, hyper-structured system of modern capitalism only emerge in the West over the last few centuries?
Yeah.
Capitalism, for Weber, is something entirely different from the lust for gold.
So how does he define it?
He defines it as the rational, continuous pursuit of profit through formally peaceful exchange, utilizing free labor and strict capital accounting.
It's those words rational and continuous that really change the game. It's not about a one-time heist or a lucky gamble. It is an organized system.
It requires regularized investment. It requires a disciplined, predictable labor force. It requires calculating exact returns on a balance sheet. But most importantly, it requires a specific moral ethos where the accumulation of wealth is not driven by the desire to consume worldly pleasures.
To make this concrete, the sources contrast two historical figures that perfectly illuminate the difference: Jacob Fugger and Benjamin Franklin.
Perfect examples.
Right. Jacob Fugger was a tremendously wealthy Renaissance banker in Germany. He was effectively the billionaire of the 16th century. And a business associate once told Fugger he should retire since he had made more than enough money and should let others have a turn. And Fugger replied that he wanted to keep making money as long as he drew breath.
Now, Weber analyzes Fugger's attitude and labels it morally neutral.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Fugger enjoyed the game of making money. He was exceptionally good at it. It was a personal inclination, a display of merchant daring. But Fugger did not view the accumulation of capital as a universal moral duty.
Now, fast forward to Benjamin Franklin in the 18th century. Weber quotes extensively from Franklin's advice to young tradesmen, and these are phrases we still use today. Remember, that time is money.
Right.
He that can earn 10 shillings a day by his labor and goes abroad or sits idle 1/2 of that day has really spent, or rather thrown away, 5 shillings. Franklin goes on to say that money is of a prolific, generating nature. Money can beget money, and its offspring can beget more.
What Weber detects in Franklin's writing is not just shrewd business advice. He detects a moral sermon. Franklin is preaching a comprehensive ethic.
A whole worldview.
Exactly. In Franklin's worldview, idleness and financial carelessness aren't just foolish mistakes. They're moral failings. Increasing your capital is elevated to an end in itself. It is a duty you owe to yourself and your community.
This is where we really need a modern analogy, because we see this everywhere today. Franklin sounds exactly like a modern Silicon Valley optimization bro on a podcast.
Perfectly.
It's the guy who wakes up at 4 a.m., takes an ice bath, drinks some highly engineered nutritional slurry, and meticulously tracks every minute of his day on a spreadsheet to maximize his output. He isn't doing this so he can buy a yacht and drink margaritas on a beach. He's doing it because the act of optimizing and producing is, to him, the highest moral good.
That is a perfect modern translation of the spirit of capitalism. It's an unnatural, ascetic devotion to acquisition and efficiency for its own sake. I mean, Franklin was notoriously frugal. The goal was not consumption. The goal was reinvestment and continuous rational action.
And this introduces the master theme of Weber's entire sociological project: rationalization. If you want to understand Weber, you really have to understand this concept.
Absolutely. Rationalization is the historical process where every aspect of human life becomes increasingly organized around calculable rules, systematic methods, and the strict mastery of means toward given ends. It's a gradual replacement of tradition, emotion, and mystery with logical calculation.
Earlier, I called it the spreadsheetification of human existence. It's that urge to quantify everything.
And Weber saw this happening uniquely in the West, across domains that had absolutely nothing to do with economics.
Like what?
Well, he points out that empirical knowledge and observation existed in China, India, and the Islamic world. But only in the West did science develop the rational, mathematically grounded laboratory experiment.
Oh, wow. And he goes into art and architecture, too, which is just wild to me.
Yeah. He notes that other cultures had polyphonic music, but only the West developed the rational harmonic triad and a mathematical system of musical notation. He points to Gothic architecture as a triumph of rationalized constructor principles like the flying buttress isn't just a decorative choice, it's a calculated mathematical distribution of weight.
It's math in stone.
Exactly. He points to the systematic jurisprudence of Roman law, which categorized human interactions into predictable logical statutes, in stark contrast to the more discretionary ad hoc legal systems found elsewhere.
So the capitalist economy is just the economic manifestation of this massive society-wide obsession with rationalization. But wait, as a student reading this, I'm encountering a methodological problem here. If Weber rejects the Austrian school's universal mathematical laws, and he agrees with the historical school that history is full of unique, complex cultural variables, how does he compare Ben Franklin to a Renaissance banker without just getting lost in the historical weeds?
This brings us to a foundational tool in social science. Weber's solution is a methodological construct he called the ideal type, in German, Idealtypus.
Okay, let's break that down, because the name is a bit confusing. It sounds like something that is ideal or perfect.
Right. It is not ideal in the normative sense of being desirable or excellent. It's ideal in the sense of being a pure idea. An ideal type is a deliberately one-sided, logically purified, and exaggerated model that a researcher constructs to measure historical reality.
Okay, so it's like drawing a caricature. Like if I draw a caricature of a politician, I exaggerate their ears or their nose to capture their essence, even though nobody actually looks exactly like that in real life.
That is an excellent way to think about it. It's an analytical caricature. When Weber uses Benjamin Franklin as the ideal type for the spirit of capitalism, he is well aware that not every single capitalist in 18th century America thought exactly like Franklin.
Right. People are messy.
Historical reality is always messy and full of contradictions. but by isolating the core logical principles of Franklin's worldview. The thrift, the punctuality, the calculation, the duty to work Weber creates a pure theoretical yardstick.
So he takes that yardstick and holds it up to different societies. How much does medieval Florence look like this yardstick? How much does 19th century London look like it?
Exactly. It allows him to rigorously compare different eras and cultures without claiming that his model exists perfectly in reality. It basically solves the method and strike deadlock. It provides theoretical rigor while respecting historical variation.
All right, so if the spirit of capitalism is this highly rationalized, methodical pursuit of profit as a duty, what was its primary obstacle? What was it fighting against? Because presumably, people didn't just wake up one day and decide to start tracking their time in 15-minute increments.
They certainly did not.
Yeah.
The enemy of the capitalist spirit was not laziness. The enemy was traditionalism.
And this is such a fascinating psychological insight. Traditionalism was the default human operating system.
And Weber gives us a brilliant, concrete example to illustrate how deeply embedded traditionalism was. He looks at agricultural piece rates.
Oh, I love this part. Let's look at this mechanism. Imagine you own a massive farm in the 19th century. You have laborers harvesting wheat, and you pay them a piece rate, say, 1 mark per acre harvested. Now, as a modern, rational capitalist, you want the harvest brought in faster before it rains, so you use logic. You increase the piece rate to 1.25 marks per acre.
Sounds rational.
You assume the laborers will work harder and faster to maximize their daily take-home pay.
But when agricultural employers actually tried this in pre-capitalist regions, what happened? The laborers worked less.
This just blows my mind. Why?
Because of the traditionalist mindset.
Yeah.
If a laborer was accustomed to earning, say, 10 marks a week to maintain his standard of living, and you suddenly increase his pay per acre, he realizes he can now earn his 10 marks by harvesting fewer acres.
Wow.
So he hits his 10 marks and just goes home early. He did not want to maximize his income. He wanted to minimize his effort to maintain his traditional, accustomed lifestyle.
This reminds me of the modern gig economy, like Uber drivers. Economists notice that sometimes when surge pricing hits and a driver is making way more money per hour, they don't drive longer to maximize the windfall. They hit their internal daily target of $150 and just log off to go be with their families.
Yeah, the algorithm is screaming at them to maximize profit, but their human instinct is to secure their traditional baseline and then stop.
That deep-seated psychological traditionalism was just an immense roadblock.
It was. And Weber also illustrates this with the story of the German putting out trade in textiles. He describes the leisurely old days of this business.
Paint that picture for us.
So, in the traditional putting out system, the organizational structure was technically capitalist. You had an entrepreneur who bought raw flax or wool, gave it to peasants to weave into cloth at home, and then took the finished cloth to sell.
Okay.
But the spirit animating the system was entirely traditional. The entrepreneur had a comfortable, modest life. He had a set number of customers, he visited them occasionally, he didn't aggressively push for massive turnover, and his competitors operated the exact same way. They might spend their evenings drinking together at the local tavern. It was an idyllic, stable state of affairs.
But then disruption hits.
Weber says that one day, a young man from one of these entrepreneurial families decides to change the unwritten rules. And he does not invent a new mechanical loom. The technology doesn't change at all. What changes is his attitude.
He undergoes a psychological shift.
Exactly. He goes directly out to the country to supervise the weavers himself. He demands higher quality. He bypasses the traditional middlemen. He starts soliciting customers directly and aggressively. He lowers his prices slightly to capture a higher volume of sales. And crucially, instead of spending his new profits on a more luxurious life, he reinvests every penny back into the business.
And what happens to the idyllic tavern evenings?
They vanish. The bitter, relentless competitive struggle begins. Everyone else in the trade is faced with a choice. Adopt this young man's ruthless, rationalized methods or go bankrupt.
Adapt or die.
Yes. The spirit of capitalism has arrived on the scene, and it destroys traditionalism not through better machinery, but through a new, methodical devotion to the business as an end in itself.
Which brings us to the core mystery. If this mindset is so unnatural, if it violates our basic human instinct to just earn enough to relax, where did that young man's psychological shift come from? What flipped the switch in the human brain that made us value endless labor over comfortable leisure?
And this brings us to the historical earthquake.
Right. Weber traces this psychological mutation to a specific event, the Protestant Reformation. But he didn't just guess this from reading theology. He started with hard data.
He did. Weber begins his inquiry by looking at occupational statistics from the state of Baden in Germany in 1895. He relies heavily on a statistical study conducted by one of his students, Martin Offenbacher.
The 1895 Baden statistics, what was the demographic reality they uncovered?
Well, Baden was a religiously mixed region, and the data showed a stark disparity. Protestants were disproportionately represented in the ownership of capital, in the management positions of modern enterprises, and in the higher ranks of skilled labor and advanced technical training.
And the Catholics.
Catholics, conversely, were far more likely to remain in traditional handicrafts, slower-paced agrarian roles, or classical non-technical education.
No, a superficial analysis might just say, well, the Protestant areas just happen to be the historically wealthier trading cities, or Protestants are just naturally more materialistic and worldly.
And Weber immediately addresses and dismantles those assumptions. He points out a glaring historical paradox. In the 16th century, it was the rising, wealthy commercial classes who enthusiastically embraced Protestantism. Why? The Catholic Church of the Middle Ages was, in daily practice, incredibly lenient and accommodating to human weakness.
Right.
Protestantism, particularly Calvinism, instituted a level of moral policing, asceticism, and ecclesiastical discipline that would be unimaginable today. It regulated everything from your clothing to your speech.
Yes. If you are a rising bourgeoisie merchant who just wants to get rich and enjoy your wealth, you don't invite the Puritans into your town to ban dancing, fine you for swearing, and dictate what color coat you can wear.
You don't willingly submit to a religious tyranny that hates luxury.
Therefore, Weber concludes, the commercial classes weren't adopting Protestantism to make life easier or more worldly. There had to be something deep within the theology itself that inadvertently forged this iron-willed commercial discipline.
Exactly. To understand what changed, we need to establish the baseline. What was the psychological reality for the average person living under medieval Catholicism?
Set the scene for us.
The Catholic system offered a very human, very cyclical rhythm of morality. Weber famously describes it as an ethical, hand-to-mouth existence.
Hand-to-mouth ethics. It perfectly captures the day-to-day nature of it.
Think about the mechanics of the sacrament of penance. You are a human, you are weak, you commit a sin, you feel remorse, you go to the priest for confession. The priest, acting with the institutional authority of the church, grants you absolution.
Right.
You perform a specific penance, and your spiritual slate is wiped clean. You are restored to a state of grace. And then inevitably, you go back out into the world, you sin again, and the cycle repeats.
There's a safety valve.
Exactly. Because you always have access to absolution, there is no overwhelming, agonizing psychological pressure to rationalize your entire life into a flawless, unbroken system of moral perfection. You can stumble, and the church will catch you.
And crucially, if you did want to achieve moral perfection, you didn't do it in the marketplace.
No, absolutely not. Catholic theology operated on a two-tiered system of morality. You had the precepta, the ordinary precepts or rules that every layperson had to follow just to be a good Christian.
Okay.
But above that, you had the Concilia Evangelica,
Yeah.
the evangelical councils. This was the path of true spiritual perfection. And it explicitly required withdrawing from the secular world. It meant taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. It meant entering a monastery or a convent.
So if you were deeply, passionately serious about God, you literally left the economy.
Yes.
The secular world of commerce, politics, and daily labor was viewed as fundamentally inferior to the ascetic, contemplative life of the monk.
That was the theological dam holding back the sanctification of worldly labor. And that is the dam that Martin Luther broke.
Enter Luther. Weber does a fascinating linguistic analysis here. He points out that the modern concept of a calling, in German, Beruf, or in English, a vocation, did not exist in antiquity or in Catholic theology in the way we use it today.
It was a linguistic innovation born out of the act of translation. When Luther translated the Bible into the German vernacular, he took the word Beruf, which previously just meant a mundane task or an occupation, and used it to translate passages regarding God's divine assignment for humanity.
And the impact of this translation choice was just seismic.
Huge. Suddenly, the everyday labor of the farmer, the blacksmith, the magistrate, the mother, it was all elevated. It was no longer just a grubby necessity for survival. It was a divine calling, a task explicitly set by God.
So Luther essentially slammed the doors of the monastery shut. He argued that withdrawing from the world was actually an evasion of duty.
Yes.
You could no longer escape the secular world to find God. You were required to serve God right where you were, in the marketplace, in the fields, in the home. Fulfilling your worldly duties became the absolute highest form of moral activity that a Christian could achieve.
It's a complete paradigm shift.
Okay, but here is where I'm going to push back. I'm a student reading this, and I'm thinking, boom, thesis solved. Luther invented the calling sanctified work, therefore Luther is the undeniable father of modern capitalism. We can all go home.
It's a tempting conclusion, but Weber is meticulous in clarifying why that is incorrect. Luther was absolutely not a capitalist. In fact, his economic views were fiercely traditionalist and in some ways highly reactionary.
He hated the big banking families, right?
He detested the Fuggers. He was deeply suspicious of usury and massive merchant capital. Furthermore, Luther's conception of the calling was ultimately static. He believed profoundly in providence, that God had placed you in your specific station in life for a reason. Your religious duty was to humbly accept your lot, do your assigned job faithfully, and not try to exceed it.
The Lord made you a shoemaker. Be the best, most faithful shoemaker you can be. But do not try to expand your shop, buy out your competitors, and become a shoe factory owner. That would be an arrogant rebellion against the station God assigned you.
Precisely. It was an ethic of obedience and submission, not an ethic of restless, dynamic optimization or upward mobility. And even more importantly, on a psychological level, Lutheranism retained a mechanism for the forgiveness of sins.
Oh, right.
Lutherans still confessed, and the believer could still regain grace through penitent faith. It lacked the terrifying, inexorable logic required to force a person to relentlessly rationalize their entire existence.
So Luther built the arena. He brought the pursuit of holiness out of the monastery and dumped it right into the middle of the worldly workplace.
Yes.
But he didn't provide the psychological engine to turn that workplace into a relentless factory of optimization. For that, we have to look to the next generation. We need John Calvin, and we need the absolute terror of predestination.
The transition from Luther to Calvin is where Weber's analysis of psychology becomes truly profound. He focuses on Calvinism, particularly as it was strictly codified a century later in the Westminster Confession of 1647.
Okay.
This document represents the doctrine of predestination in its most magnificently consistent and horrifying form.
Let's break this doctrine down, because to a modern ear, it sounds incredibly dark. What exactly is predestination?
The doctrine begins with the absolute, infinite majesty and sovereignty of God. Human beings, by contrast, are finite, fallen, and utterly corrupt. God, in his unfathomable wisdom, has decreed from before the very creation of the universe that a specific, unalterable portion of humanity is destined for eternal salvation. These are the elect.
And the rest.
The rest of humanity is destined for eternal damnation.
And here is the mechanism that just breaks the human mind.
Yeah.
Nothing you do can change it.
Nothing. Your good works cannot earn you salvation because you are a fallen creature and the gap between you and God is infinite. Your intense faith cannot compel God to save you because faith itself is a gift that God only gives to the elect. Christ did not die for everyone. His sacrifice was exclusively for the elect. God's decrees are eternal and unchangeable.
So I want to vividly imagine sitting in a 17th century Puritan meeting house listening to this theology. I am told that my eternal fate, everlasting paradise, or everlasting hellfire, is already locked in. The ink is dry. I can't earn it through charity. The church cannot give it to me through rituals. The priest cannot absolve me. What happens to the human psyche when it truly believes this?
Weber uses a phrase that I think is one of the most haunting in all of sociology. Unprecedented inner loneliness.
Unprecedented inner loneliness. Wow.
Imagine the sheer terrifying isolation. No one can help you. No priest can intervene for you. No sacraments can impart grace. This is the ultimate culmination of a historical process Weber calls Entzauberung, or disenchantment.
That is a massive concept for any undergraduate to lock onto. Entzauberung, the elimination of magic from the world.
Calvinism stripped away all the magical, mystical elements of religion. There are no holy relics to touch for grace. There are no magical incantations. There is no priest who possesses the supernatural power to transform bread into the body of Christ and wipe away your sins.
You're just on your own.
You are stripped bare, utterly alone before an inscrutable, transcendent God, facing an eternity that has already been decided. You cannot even fully trust your friends or family because you do not know if they are elect or damned.
Okay, looking at this logically, the immediate question is, how did an entire society of people believing this not just collapse into absolute paralyzing despair, or, on the flip side, pure hedonistic nihilism? Like, if I'm damned no matter what, why not just go drink and gamble? If I'm saved no matter what, why not just go drink and gamble?
And that is the exact crisis the pastoral leadership faced. John Calvin himself did not suffer from this anxiety because he possessed the towering arrogance of a prophet. He was absolutely convinced he was a chosen tool of divine providence.
Right.
But for the ordinary believer in the pews, the tension was unbearable. Am I one of the elect? Am I saved? That question became the agonizing, obsessive center of their entire existence. And the pastors had to find a practical way to answer it.
So what was the pastoral workaround to save people from despair?
It developed into two distinct, highly effective pastoral rules. First, the pastors instructed the congregation that it was an absolute moral duty to consider oneself to be one of the elect. To harbor any doubts about your salvation was framed as a lack of faith, a temptation whispered by the devil. You had to project absolute, unwavering self-confidence.
It's the ultimate version of fake it till you make it, but with your eternal soul on the line.
Precisely. But the second rule was the game changer. How do you maintain that intense self-confidence? The pastors prescribed intense, methodical, worldly activity. Restless, continuous work in your calling was presented as the most suitable and most effective means to disperse religious doubt and provide yourself with the subjective certainty of your own salvation.
The certitudo salutis, the certainty of grace.
This is the crucial logical pivot that changes history. The pastors made it clear that good works could not cause or earn salvation. That would be sliding back into Catholic heresy. But a life of systematic, disciplined, successful good works could serve as a technical proof that you were already saved.
Explain that logic a bit more. How does it prove it?
The theology argued that if God had elected you, His divine grace would naturally operate through you. You would be capable of living a sanctified life for the glory of God. Therefore, by constantly monitoring your own behavior and forcing yourself into a rigid mold of ascetic discipline and productive labor, you could look at the results of your life and say, "Behold, I am living righteously and prospering in my calling. This must be the evidence that God's grace is within me."
You are proving your salvation to yourself.
Yes.
This is what Weber calls inner-worldly asceticism, innerweltliche Ascese. You are practicing the intense, self-denying discipline of a monk. You're controlling your impulses, eliminating spontaneous pleasure, rigorously organizing your time, but you are doing it inside the worldly economy. You are a monk in the marketplace.
And unlike the Catholic cycle of sin and repentance, this system demanded perfection. You couldn't just do a good deed on Tuesday and commit a sin on Wednesday.
No safety valve.
Exactly. The Calvinist God demanded a lifetime of constant self-control. It required bringing total rational order into the conduct of every single minute of every single day.
To really drive home how deeply this shifted the human mindset, Weber uses a series of literary analogies that are just brilliant. He contrasts three massive works of literature to show the evolution of the Western soul. He starts with Dante's Divine Comedy, the masterpiece of the Catholic Middle Ages. How does Dante's epic journey end?
It ends in paradise. Dante has traveled through hell and purgatory, and finally he's standing still, silently contemplating the blinding, perfect light of God in the form of a rose. It is a posture of serene, quiet, passive contemplation. The highest good is rest in the divine presence.
Right. And then Weber moves forward to John Milton's Paradise Lost, written by an English Puritan. Adam and Eve have just been expelled from the Garden of Eden. It's a tragedy, but the ending isn't entirely despairing. They are walking out into the harsh world hand in hand with Providence their guide. It's active. They're entering the world of labor, history, and struggle.
And the most striking, devastating example is John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which was basically the most widely read book in Puritan England next to the Bible.
This one is wild. Walk us through the opening scene.
So Christu, the protagonist, realizes that his city, the city of destruction, is going to be judged by God. He is terrified for the fate of his individual soul. What does he do? He plugs his ears with his fingers so he cannot hear the cries of his family. He abandons his wife and children, and he runs out across the plain crying, "Life, life, eternal life."
He literally abandons his family to save his own soul.
It perfectly encapsulates that unprecedented inner loneliness. The Puritan is a solitary runner. He is actively fleeing the temptations of the world, but he is forced to do it while living in the world. Doing business with people, he must treat with a certain cool, detached instrumentality. Because anyone, his business partner, his neighbor, even his wife, might be one of the damned.
That is just a phenomenal way to understand the psychology of the era. It wasn't about greed, it was about sheer terror and isolation. Now, Weber doesn't just stop at Calvinism. He wants to prove this wasn't a fluke. So he briefly tests this psychological mechanism against three other branches of ascetic Protestantism. Let's look at how he does this, utilizing a concept he borrowed from chemistry: elective affinity or Wahlverwandtschaft.
Yes, the term originally comes from alchemy and a novel by Goethe. It described how certain chemical elements are naturally drawn to combine with each other. Weber uses it to describe how certain religious ideas and certain economic dispositions mutually select for and reinforce one another over time. He tests this on Pietism, Methodism, and the Baptist sects.
Let's run through them quickly. What about Pietism?
Pietism emerged within Lutheranism. It softened the harsh, dogmatic edges of predestination. It sought a more emotional, almost mystical inner relationship with God. However, it retained the strict requirement for intense, methodical self-examination. Because it was more emotional and less aggressively outwardly focused, Weber notes that Pietism tended to produce incredibly faithful, dutiful clerks, officials, and laborers, rather than the hard-driving, risk-taking, world-conquering entrepreneurs of Calvinism. The affinity was slightly different.
Then you have Methodism, which arose later in the 18th century in England under John Wesley.
Methodism was heavily focused on a visceral, emotional conversion experience. You had to feel the grace of God entering you. But once converted, the anxiety returned. How do you know the conversion was real and permanent?
Back to the proof.
Exactly. The answer was to subject the believer to incredibly systematic, methodical rules of conduct, hence the name Methodist, to prove their ongoing state of grace. It re-injected the rationalized discipline into everyday life.
And finally, the Baptist sect, the Quakers, the Mennonites. They didn't believe in predestination at all, so how did they fit the theory?
Here, the mechanism wasn't predestination. It was the concept of the believer's church. In the 16th century, the state church included everyone born in a territory. The Baptists rejected this. They believed the church should be a voluntary sect of only the proven regenerate.
Oh, I see.
To be admitted to a Quaker or Baptist congregation, and to avoid excommunication, you had to continuously demonstrate a radically pure, honest, ascetic lifestyle to your peers.
And this had massive economic consequences.
Huge consequences. Because if you were a member in good standing of a Quaker sect, it meant you had survived intense moral scrutiny. Therefore, other merchants knew you were absolutely trustworthy. You wouldn't lie, cheat, or default on a debt.
Which is huge for business.
It created incredibly tight networks of trust and credit among sect members, which was a massive competitive advantage in early commercial capitalism. If you were excommunicated for moral failure, you lost your credit line and your business collapsed.
So across all these theological variations, the core behavioral output remains exactly the same. Methodical, disciplined, rationalized conduct in your worldly calling as the ultimate proof of your spiritual worth. Which brings us to section 5, the aftermath. What happens when you let this engine run?
To understand the sheer force of this engine, we have to look at the practical, everyday advice these ministers were giving to their flocks. Weber leans heavily on the writings of Richard Baxter, a prominent 17th century English Puritan divine.
Yeah.
Baxter wrote massive encyclopedic guides to Christian behavior. And when you read Baxter, it is startling. It reads like a modern capitalist self-help book wrapped in Bible verses.
It really does. What is his stance on wealth? Because traditionally, the church said wealth was a spiritual danger.
Baxter preaches that wealth itself is not inherently sinful. What is sinful is the temptation that wealth brings, the temptation to idleness, to the spontaneous enjoyment of life, to the sins of the flesh, to luxury.
Idleness is the ultimate enemy.
Wasting time is, in principle, the deadliest of all sins. Every single hour lost to idle gossip, to sleeping longer than is strictly necessary for health, to playing games. That is an hour stolen from the service of God's glory. Baxter is ruthless about this. Even extended religious contemplation in a cloister is suspect if it detracts from your daily active labor.
And he loves the division of labor. This is where religion and economics completely fuse.
Yes. Adam Smith argued for the division of labor and specialization, purely based on economic efficiency. It produces more pins per hour. But a century earlier, Richard Baxter argued for specialization because God demands maximum qualitative productivity from your soul.
That's wild.
If you specialize in a specific calling, you develop a methodical, highly skilled rhythm of work. You are less likely to be distracted. You serve the community better, which glorifies God. Therefore, highly specialized, continuous labor is a divine command.
This highlights the great tragic irony of history that Weber is trying to illuminate.
It is the ultimate unintended consequence. Here you have a massive religious movement, ascetic Protestantism, that was obsessively, entirely focused on the next world. They cared about nothing but the salvation of the soul. They viewed the material world as corrupt, and yet entirely accidentally, they built the most powerful engine of material wealth creation in human history.
Because they created an entire society of people who worked relentlessly, generated massive amounts of capital, but were forbidden by their strict religion from spending that capital on luxury, ostentation, or enjoyment. So what happens to the money?
It cannot be consumed, so it must be saved and reinvested. It becomes capital. It funds the expansion of businesses, the building of new factories, the optimization of trade routes. The religious asceticism provided the exact psychological conditions necessary for the primitive accumulation of capital. It broke the bonds of traditionalism.
But then the plot thickens, because as we know from history, religious zeal eventually cools down.
Exactly. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, actually foresaw this. He wrote that wherever true religion increases, industry and frugality increase, which inevitably produces wealth. But as wealth increases, pride, anger, and the love of the world increase in equal measure.
A self-defeating cycle.
The intense, terrifying religious enthusiasm of the 17th century gives way to the more comfortable, secular utilitarianism of the 18th century.
Enter Benjamin Franklin again.
Precisely. Franklin retains all the mechanical habits of the Puritan, the thrift, the intense focus on time, the relentless work ethic, but he loses the theology of predestination. The pursuit of wealth is no longer about proving your salvation to an inscrutable God. It just becomes about being a respectable, successful, upstanding citizen. The religious roots die off, but the behavior remains.
And that brings us to the climax of Weber's essay, and probably the most famous metaphor in all of sociology, the iron cage.
In the original German text, Weber uses the term Stahlhartes Gehäuse. Literally, this translates to a steel-hard housing, or a shell as hard as steel. Talcott Parsons, the translator of our text, famously rendered this into English as the iron cage.
It's worth pausing on that translation difference. A cage is something put over you. A shell, like a snail shell, is something you grow around yourself until it hardens and traps you. Both are terrifying, but the shell implies we built it ourselves. How does Weber deploy this metaphor?
Weber points back to Richard Baxter. Baxter had written that for the true Christian, the care for external material goods should only lie on the shoulders like a light cloak, which can be thrown aside at any moment. The Puritan wanted to be in the world, but not of it.
But Weber writes, fate decreed that the cloak should become an iron cage.
What he means is that the religious scaffolding that originally built the modern capitalist economy has rotted away. The Puritan theology of calling and predestination is gone. But the massive, mechanized, bureaucratic economic order they helped build is still here.
It stayed behind.
It is hardened into a permanent structure, and it now dictates the lives of every single individual born into it with irresistible force.
You don't get a choice anymore.
No. As Weber puts it so chillingly, the Puritan wanted to work in a calling. We are forced to do so. The modern economic order rests on mechanical foundations. It doesn't need your religious fervor anymore. If you want to survive in this system, to pay your rent and feed your family, you are compelled to adopt the rationalized, calculating, specialized behavior of the system, regardless of what you actually believe in your soul. The system runs itself.
We are trapped in the machine our ancestors built to please God. Weber closes this entire essay with a haunting quote from Goethe to describe the modern professionals who are trapped in this cage, mindlessly optimizing their lives without knowing why. He calls them specialists without spirit, sensualists without heart. This nullity imagines that it has attained a level of civilization never before achieved.
It is a profound prophetic warning. Weber is warning us about the mechanization of human life, disguised as progress and self-congratulations. We are incredibly efficient, but we have lost the profound meaning that originally drove that efficiency.
It is a brilliant, beautiful, and deeply tragic narrative. It explains so much about why our culture feels the way it does, but, and this is a massive but, especially for you as a social science student trying to parse theory from reality, is it actually historically and statistically true?
And that is the ultimate test. Does the thesis survive contact with the actual historical and statistical record? Because almost immediately after Weber published this in 1905, the academic knives came out.
Yes, historians and economists have been brawling over this for over a century. Let's look at some of the early critics to see how they attack the theory. First up, R.H. Tawney.
Tawney was a brilliant British economic historian who wrote Religion and the Rise of Capitalism in 1926. Tawney broadly accepted that there was a deep link between Puritanism and capitalism, but he argued that Weber had the causality reversed.
Meaning the material economy changed first, and the religion just adapted to fit it. That sounds like a return to the Marxist view.
It's closely aligned with it. Tawney argued that a commercial, acquisitive, capitalist society was already rapidly emerging in England and Holland due to massive shifts in global trade. The Puritan sects didn't invent this new economy, they were simply living in it.
Hey.
And over time, they adapted their theology to justify and make sense of the new economic reality they found themselves navigating. They compromised with the market. So capitalism invented the Puritan work ethic, not the other way around.
Then you have Kurt Samuelsson, a Swedish economic historian who attacked it in the 1950s.
Samuelsson went directly after the empirical historical record. He pointed out glaring geographical anomalies. For instance, the Catholic region of Belgium industrialized just as early and as vigorously as Protestant Holland.
Good point.
Furthermore, he argued that many of the so-called Puritan entrepreneurs that Weber and others cited were, upon closer biographical inspection, barely religious at all. They were ruthless businessmen who just happened to live in Protestant countries.
And Hugh Trevor Roper, the famous British historian, had a totally different take on the data.
Trevor Roper looked at the data showing Protestants excelling in business, and he argued it wasn't about Calvinist theology at all. It was about the historical accident of persecution.
Persecution?
Yeah. During the vicious wars of religion in Europe, massive networks of highly skilled merchants and craftsmen, like the French Huguenots and Sephardic Jews, were forcibly exiled. They fled as refugees to northern European cities, bringing their liquid capital, their international networks, and their advanced business techniques with them. It was a massive brain drain of minorities that sparked the economic boom in those cities, regardless of their specific theology.
Okay, so the historians have been poking holes in the narrative for decades. But recently, modern economists have entered the chat with massive data sets and supercomputers. They have tried to subject Weber's thesis to rigorous econometric testing. Let's talk about the heavy hitters. First, Davide Cantoni in 2015.
Cantoni designed an incredible natural experiment. He looked at 272 cities within the Holy Roman Empire, tracking their economic growth over a massive 600-year period from 1300 to 1900. Because the Reformation swept through Germany in a highly patchwork way, some cities went Protestant, some stayed Catholic, often just based on the whim or political calculation of the local prince. It provided a perfect localized testing ground to see if Protestantism actually caused a divergence in wealth.
Hold on, if I'm reading Cantoni's data right, it totally invalidates the first 3 chapters of Weber's book.
The results were devastating for the strict Weberian thesis. Cantoni found absolutely zero statistically detectable effect of Protestantism on economic growth. Zero. Over centuries, when you control for geography and other factors, the Protestant cities did not outpace the Catholic cities in population growth or economic vitality. The data simply did not show the Calvinist engine producing more wealth.
Boom. That feels like a death blow. If the 272 cities show no difference, Weber was just spinning a beautiful, tragic myth. But wait, the literature gives us another major modern study. Becker and Vossman in 2009. They looked at data from Prussian counties in the late 19th century.
Yes, and Becker and Vossman actually did find exactly what Weber's student Martin Offenbacher found back in 1895. In late 19th century Prussia, the Protestant counties were indeed measurably more prosperous than the Catholic counties.
Okay, so Weber's starting data was right. The Protestants were richer.
They were richer. But here is the incredible plot twist of modern data science. Becker and Vossman dug deeper into the statistical mechanisms to find out why they were wealthier. Was it because of Calvinist anxiety, interworldly asceticism, and the relentless work ethic? No. They found that the prosperity gap was almost entirely explained by one single, highly measurable variable.
Literacy.
Literacy. Just the ability to read.
Think back to what Martin Luther fundamentally demanded. He demanded that every single believer must be able to read the Word of God in their own native language. To achieve that religious goal, Protestant communities had to build schools. They had to systematically teach boys, and crucially girls, to read. It was a religious imperative.
Oh, wow.
But as a completely unintended side effect of wanting people to read the Bible, they accidentally built massive reserves of human capital.
Right.
When the Industrial Revolution arrived centuries later, requiring a workforce that could read instructions, operate complex machinery, and keep ledgers, the Protestant regions had a massively more educated population ready to adapt. It was education, not the psychological terror of predestination, that drove their eventual economic dominance. Okay, as a student trying to wrap my head around this, I have to ask the obvious, blunt question here. If The historical data says the causality might be reversed, and the modern quantitative data says the psychological anxiety theory is wrong, and the wealth gap was just an accident of literacy. Why did we just spend an hour doing a deep dive into this book? Why is Weber still considered the undisputed canonical figure in sociology?
Because, while this specific, narrow, empirical claim about Calvinism causing capitalism might be historically flawed, the conceptual apparatus that Weber invented to make that claim is the absolute foundation of modern social science. He changed how we study human beings.
Let's break that down. What are the enduring tools he gave us?
First, he gave us the ideal type, a rigorous methodology to build logical models to compare incredibly complex historical eras without getting lost in the details. He gave us elective affinity, a nuanced way of understanding how ideas and economic structures mutually reinforce each other, moving beyond simplistic A causes B determinism.
Right.
He gave us the overarching, terrifyingly accurate theory of rationalization, a lens through which we can understand everything from modern algorithmic law to the architecture of the bureaucratic state.
And crucially, he pushed back against the purely materialist view of history.
Absolutely. He proved that subjective values, what people believe in the deepest, darkest recesses of their souls, must be treated as independent, serious causal variables in history. You cannot understand human behavior just by looking at bank accounts and material interests. You have to understand the meaning people attach to their actions.
Yeah.
That insight alone heavily influenced thinkers like Talcott Parsons and the entire school of structural functionalism. Weber gave us the vocabulary to understand ourselves.
Which brings us to our wrap-up. We have gone on a massive intellectual journey today. We started in the academic brawls of 1900 Germany between the historical and Austrian schools. We looked at the Catholic confessionals and the revolutionary linguistic shift of Luther's Beruf, or calling. We stared into the terrifying psychological abyss of Calvinist predestination, seeing how the horror of unprecedented inner loneliness forced people to work relentlessly just to prove they were saved.
Quite a journey.
And we watched that feverish religious devotion harden and cool into the secular, mechanical iron cage of modern bureaucracy, only to see modern economists challenge the whole narrative with data about literacy and refugee networks.
And yet, despite all the historical critiques, Weber's core psychological insights remain profoundly, uncomfortably relevant to you, the listener, sitting on that couch today.
They really do, because we still live deep inside the shadow of this history. We still use the word calling when we talk about finding our career path, as if our 9-to-5 job is a divine destiny we must discover. We still judge our own and other people's moral worth by how hard they appear to work.
Exactly.
And we still feel that deep, irrational, gnawing guilt when we aren't constantly optimizing our time and being productive.
Weber gives us the conceptual vocabulary to understand why our culture treats the economy as a religion, even long after the traditional gods have departed from the public square.
And so I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to mull over as you navigate your own education and career. We know from Weber that the iron cage was originally forged by the Puritans out of the sheer terror of divine damnation. But today, for most of the modern workforce, that theology is entirely gone. We live in a largely secular, or at least highly pluralistic, economic world.
True.
So what is maintaining the bars of the cage today? Is the modern epidemic of burnout, the total nervous exhaustion we feel from constantly trying to optimize our lives, our bodies, our personal brands, our careers, simply a secularized version of Calvinist anxiety? Are we endlessly, frantically exhausting ourselves to prove our ultimate worth to a faceless market because we no longer have a God to prove it to?
That is the terrifying question Max Weber forces us to ask ourselves every single time we clock in.
Thanks for taking the plunge with us. We'll see you next time.